Welcome to this MOOC titled China and the Long Century of Humiliation. This MOOC is part of the Introduction to Chinese Politics and Society course. I'm Jasper Roctus. I'm affiliated to Ghent University and funded by the FWO Foundation. This is what we are going to talk about today. Basically, the loss of power, the loss of territories, the loss of influence of China in the late 19th century and early 20th century. We'll get to that. We'll start, however, in the present day. This so-called Century of Humiliation, in Chinese, still holds major relevance in, for example, foreign policy rhetoric nowadays. For example, in Alaska, in March 2021, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs angrily compared the demands made by the US side, negotiations over the trade war, to the treatment of China 120 years ago during this so-called Century of Humiliation. And they stated, today's China is not the China of 120 years ago. Also, many propaganda teams, for example, in the field of education, reminded Chinese people to never forget about our national humiliation. There are also many memorials, many that have been recently constructed, actually, that refer to past experiences of humiliation. For example, the memorial to the right, which refers to the September 18, 1931 incident, which was the invasion of Japan and Manchuria. We'll also get to that. Also, there's Taiwan, which is often referred to as a product of this century of humiliation. So what is just being talked about when this is invoked? This is what we will talk about today, the history of this century of humiliation. We'll start the story in the late 18th, early 19th century. Basically, the Manchu-led Qing dynasty, which is the final imperial dynasty of China. Manchu people are a minority people in the north of China who had managed to succeed the Ming dynasty in the 17th century, reached the zenith of power in the early and mid-18th century, then started a gradual decline due to many reasons, such as intrigues at the court, rebellions in the empire's periphery, lack of financial and administrative reform, and unconstrained demographic growth. Until 1839, and that date is in bold because it's a very significant date in the lecture of today, the Qing Empire, however, was largely able to check foreign encroachment. And just some examples, they were able to sign in to defeat the Russians in the 17th century and sign a border treaty that gave them parts of Siberia. They managed to prohibit Christianity and Catholic missionary activities in 1724 without the Western powers really able to react. Also, until the early 19th century, the Qing dynasty generally enjoyed a large trade surplus over the Western nations. They were exporting porcelain, tea, silk through only one sanctioned port, Guangzhou, or also known as Canton, where they had an import-export monopoly in the city, which was known as Gonggang, the public trade system. Basically, you see an artistic depiction of this. This was one enclave where the Western powers were able to open a factory from where they could conduct their trade. And the Qing dynasty really had the edge in this trade. Around the early 19th century, however, the rapidly industrializing Western countries, particularly Great Britain, start to look for ways to break the Qing dynasty's monopoly on trade, reverse this trade deficit, and overcome the ban on Christian missionary activity. And this would lead in 1839 to the so-called First Opium War. Why Opium War? Well, basically, the British were trying to overcome this trade deficit by exporting opium to China. Then the Qing dynasty implemented the ban and Great Britain attacked. Great Britain, which had already significantly industrialized and modernized its military during this time, was able to swiftly crush the Qing dynasty. And in 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing was signed, which stipulated the cession of Hong Kong to Great Britain, the fact that Britain would have the so-called most favored nation clause, which means that all future concessions to any other power would also apply to Great Britain. The Gonggang system that I just explained was abolished in favor of 5 free trade ports, where Westerners would enjoy low tax rates and extraterritorial privileges. This would be known as the concessions, a term that will return. And there would be enormous financial indemnities. As you see, I underlined the Treaty of Nanking here. But this was one of the treaties which would later be known as an unequal treaty. But this is a term that will be coined later. We will get back to that. So all the subsequent treaties are also underlined. That would be coined as an unequal treaty. After 2 decades, however, the Second Opium War would break out. Britain was extremely dissatisfied that many countries had joined the list of privileged trading partners, and that the Qing dynasty did not implement all the terms as well as they wanted. They were soon joined by France, and they attacked again. And again, the Qing Empire was swiftly defeated. The Summer Palace, as you see to the top right, was sacked and burned, an event that's known to be in Chinese historical memory to be extremely humiliating. And many more concessions were made in the 1860 Convention of Beijing, also to Imperial Russia, despite the fact that he had not been part of the war. Hong Kong was expanded with the cession of Kowloon. Even more trade ports were established. Free movement of the Westerners over the Yangtze, the so-called Long River. The rights of Christians and missionaries were greatly expanded, and Russia regains large swaths of Siberia. Also during this time, this was the Taiping Rebellion. This was an internal conflict of a group that basically Christian-inspired group with proto-socialist egalitarian ideals that rose up against the Qing dynasty and at first conquered large swaths of China, as you can see to the bottom right. In absolute numbers, this is likely the bloodiest rebellion in human history. But it was crushed in 1864. And why was it crushed? Actually, through Western help. This might sound somewhat contradictory, considering what I just told about the Opium Wars, but the Western powers decided, after this Convention of Beijing was signed, to help the Qing dynasty in crushing the Taiping Rebellion, because they wanted to ensure that their privileges with the government, the Qing government, would remain. A new government might oppose this, after all. 1839, through all these events, subsequently gradually takes shape as the start of modern Chinese history. But there is, during this time, no discourse on something as national humiliation or unequal treaties yet. This would only come later. So how does the Qing dynasty react to all this? Well, they try to modernize somehow. One of the things that happens is that a so-called office in charge of affairs concerning all nations is opened, which is essentially China's first ever Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This was extremely reluctant. Before this, basically the emperor had always been the center of tribute from the Chinese periphery or from far abroad. There had never been such a concept as foreign affairs, and even they tried to in this forum, foreign affairs in the Western sense was not yet fully embraced. The emperor was ensured that this was a lowly office, it was not that important. The emperor actually, a year after that, passes away. His widow, Cixi, and her conservative allies at the court would hold considerable power, and he would use this conservative power on many occasions over the next half century or so. Still, many of the lower local Qing officials pursued policies that would become known as the self-strengthening movement, Zheqiang Yudong. Not many of these were actually united in one general movement, but they were all attempts at somehow modernizing China, and most of all, its military. The goal for many of these was to somehow retain a Chinese core while modernizing economic and military matters, and this is known as Zhongti Xiyong. Chinese learning as substance, Western learning for application. However, there was another nation close by China, which had actually modernized more rapidly and had westernized much more wholeheartedly than the Qing dynasty, initially at least. This was Japan, through its so-called Meiji Restoration. And Japan, with its highly modernized military, in 1894 decides to attack China over the state of Korea. Korea had traditionally always been a Chinese vassal state, had at least been in one way or another in the Chinese sphere of influence, and Japan wanted to change this, and Japan succeeds in this. It crushes the Qing dynasty's fleet. They had tried to build some modern battleships and land forces. And in 1895, another treaty which would later be known as an unequal treaty was signed, the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Taiwan is annexed outright by Japan under this treaty. Korea is put in the Japanese sphere of influence and would be annexed in 1905. And there would be large indemnities from the Qing government to Japan. However, some of the Japanese gains are limited by Western intervention. There's something that Japan would hold against the West until much, much later, but that's a story for another lecture. Japan also joins the list as most favored nations and growing lists as the privileged trading partner of Qing China. And it was actually the first non-Western nation to do so. This humiliating defeat can be considered extra painful since the victor this time was a country that always had been seen in China as a little brother. Note that at this point, still, all these experiences that I have just explained are not yet defined as national humiliation yet, and the treaty is not as unequal. The large parts of the population just, well, things happened as they happened. Still, in the Qing court, the elite would grow increasingly desperate. And Emperor Guangxu, who had been installed by Cixi as a child emperor, then came of age in the 1890s, manages to curb the influence of Cixi and her conservative allies somewhat, and supports the 100 days reforms, Wushu Bianfa. These were attempts to somehow, to modernize many aspects of the Qing dynasty, transfer it to a constitutional monarchy, finally reform the military, abolish the traditional examination system, experiment with capitalism, etc., etc. However, as you noticed maybe from the name, 100 days reform, after 100 days, these attempts were curbed by a coup by Cixi and her conservative allies. Most of the reformists were killed or either exiled, like Kang Youwei, you see to the top right corner, who had really been a proponent of Zhongti Xiyong, retaining the Chinese core while applying Western sciences. A year after this failed reform attempt, there would be a new movement. Initially, this was a movement that was against the Qing dynasty, the Boxer movement, Yihetuan. However, Cixi managed to shift the aims of this movement against Christians and eventually all foreigners in China. And after many Westerners are killed by these so-called Boxers, and their legislations in Beijing are besieged by these Boxers, an expedition to restore order, supported by 8 nations, 7 Western nations and Japan, is created. Should be noted that many Qing governments and local officials refused to support Cixi and the Boxers and tried to stay neutral throughout this conflict. Be it as it may, in 1900s, Beijing falls to this Western coalition force. You see to the right, you see this soldiers of this alliance parade in the Forbidden City. And peace is restored in 1901. In 1901, another humiliating treaty would be signed, the so-called Boxer Protocol, stipulates more indemnities and many more humiliating terms, such as the forced opening of a proper foreign ministry, not like the one that I mentioned before, that was like kind of an in-between way. And the emperor even had to apologize for the Boxers' killings, which was, of course, extremely humiliating. In the early 1900s, the Qing dynasty tries to reform in their so-called new policies, Xinzheng. This can be described as too late, too little, and might even have sped up the eventual Qing collapse. Why? One of the reforms was that students could go abroad, especially to Japan, to learn about Western sciences. But basically, all the students that would go to Japan would join revolutionary anti-Qing organizations, such as those of Sun Yat-sen, you see the top right corner. There would also be major military reforms, finally, but this effectively handed power to the generals of the so-called new army that was created, such as the person to the bottom right corner, Yuan Shikai. And through a sort of alliance from this Yuan Shikai with Sun Yat-sen and his revolutionaries, the Qing dynasty finally collapsed in 1912. And Sun Yat-sen would become provisional president, after which, through an agreement, Yuan Shikai succeeded him. This led to a short period of great national pride. China had become a modern republic, had perhaps the humiliation come to an end. There would be relatively free elections in the late 1912 and early 1913s. Sun Yat-sen's Chinese Nationalist Party, Zhongguo Kuomintang, KMT, wins in a landslide. Then, however, Yuan Shikai cracks down on the KMT in early 1913 and seizes absolute power. And through iron-fisted manner, he basically retains this power until 1915. And in 1950, something very significant would happen. In 1915, Japan would state its 21 demands over the new Republic of China. Basically, these demands, to summarize it very briefly, would make the Republic of China into a Japanese protectorate, and colony maybe even. Despite the fact that Yuan Shikai managed to negotiate with the Japanese, and the Japanese dropped their most stringent demands, something different happened in China. Basically, there was a large outpouring amongst the people of national humiliation sentiment, and basically the narrative started to take shape that China had been non-stop humiliated since 1839. There would, for example, be a massive spontaneous anti-Japanese economic boycott that takes shape. It was not even supported by Yuan Shikai's government, that still takes shape. This all would be the beginning of the end for Yuan Shikai's government, which would be seen as having betrayed Chinese interests. This kind of anti-imperial sentiment would be reinforced in 1990 through the Treaty of Versailles. And yes, the Treaty of Versailles is indeed in China seen as another unequal treaty. Why? Because it handed German possessions in Shandong, a province in the north of China, to Japan. This despite the fact that China, just like Japan, had both participated on the Entente, the Allied side, in World War I. Despite the fact that in 1922, in the end, the decision of the Treaty of Versailles was reversed and China did get Shandong back, despite the fact that the Japanese retain a lot of power in the region, the case was already made, and a lot of anti-imperialist humiliation sentiment would take shape in China. Also significant is that in the Treaty of Versailles, the concessions are not handed back despite Chinese requests. All this is a prelude for future issues with Japan yet to come. After the death of Yuan Shikai in 1916, China had actually fragmented and many fiefdoms led by warlords. Also a reason why they could not really make a fist in 1990 against the Treaty of Versailles. During this warlord era, which lasted until 1928, the central government in Beijing, which constantly changed hands, held little to no power of the rest of China. Then in 1928, Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek, the successor of Sun Yat-sen, manages to reunite most of China. They did this through a coalition together with the communists, Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party, and by 1928 had at least nominally reunited China. At least all the other significant other warlords decided to support his cause. But you can see to the right that actual control was very limited by the KMT. Shortly after this, however, civil war between the former allies, the CCP of Mao Zedong and the KMT of Chiang Kai-shek erupted. So still we have a fragment in China. Still, China is more united after this than it had at least been for some time, and Japan does not like this. This leads, and remember the first slide that I showed you, to the September 18, 1931 incident where Japan invades northeast China through a false flag incident. They made up an assassination. Japan had been greatly dissatisfied with the loss of influence in the northeast Chinese region, Manchuria as they call it, which had been pro-Japanese throughout most of the warlord era. In 1932, the KMT of Chiang Kai-shek was forced to sign the Tanggu Truce, another unequal treaty. And by this time, these things are actually called unequal treaties. The KMT de facto accepts the loss of northeast China. However, this was indeed a calculated loss. Chiang Kai-shek realizes that a full-scale Japanese invasion is coming, and he tries to buy time and he decides to try to use this time that he has to first crush the communists and then also modernize his military. The first goal fails. The communists escape KMT's encirclement in their long march, famously, then forced Chiang into another united front during the late 1936 against Japan. The second goal of modernizing the KMT's military partly succeeds with German assistance, so a not well-known chapter in Chinese history, although it's limited to a select few army divisions, a bit in the style of the modernizations with the new army. And indeed, in July 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War breaks out. Japan invades the major cities along the coastline and in the north of China. The war, after initial Japanese gains, basically changes into an extremely bloody stalemate from 1938 onwards. And on December 8, 1941, the fortunes of China change in their favor after Japan attacks Pearl Harbor and China becomes one of the Allied powers in World War II. So this would develop to November 1943, where Chiang Kai-shek basically, and the situation in China by then is still the same, basically a stalemate between the Japanese and the Chinese, Chiang Kai-shek experienced his finest hour. His Republic of China is recognized as one of the major powers in the world, and to be recognized as one of the major powers after the war. The ROC becomes one of the founding members of the United Nations and becomes a permanent member of its Security Council. And the return of Taiwan is promised after Japan's return. And the Allies significantly finally promised to hand over their remaining concessions after the war, exception being British Hong Kong. Some in the KMT, still nowadays, the party is now on Taiwan, view this moment as the end of the Century of Humiliation. They have, admittedly, a case if you compare this to the treatment that China received, for example, after World War I. This is indeed a lot better. However, from the KMT's perspective, a massive Japanese offensive in 1944, when they were not expecting it anymore, spoils Chiang's victorious roots and greatly weakens the power of the KMT. Still, Japan surrenders a year later after the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the ROC does indeed regain Taiwan and the concessions, again, except for British Hong Kong. Immediately after the war ends with Japan, almost immediately, civil war between the KMT and the communists resumes. And the KMT, by this time, was greatly weakened and completely overextended, suffering from internal corruption, among many reasons that they are unable to stop the communists. And in October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong famously proclaims the foundation of the People's Republic of China, the PRC. Chiang Kai-shek and then about 2 million KMT loyalists flee to Taiwan. For that, also refer to the MOOC on Taiwan's history. A week before this foundation of the PRC, Mao had famously spoken these words on the Century of Humiliation. From now on, our nation will belong to the community of peace-loving and freedom-loving nations in the world. It will work courageously and industriously to foster its own civilization and well-being. It will, at the same time, promote world peace and freedom. Our nation will no longer be subject to insult and humiliation. We have already stood up. However, remember, at the beginning of this lecture, in the 1980s and 1990s, the century made a prominent feedback and still is there in Chinese narratives. To this, also refer to other MOOCs on the developments after the demise of Mao Zedong. With this, I bring this MOOC to an end.